The cops from Beacon County roll up to the woods with search dogs and flashlights looking for a missing body. Meanwhile, Scott McCall is at home fixing his lacrosse stick, doing pull-ups and getting ready for bed. Then he hears a noise outside. Grabbing a bat, he steps onto the porch only to nearly take a swing at his best friend Styles Stalinsky, who's hanging from the gutter like a raccoon. Styles, always up to something, spills the news his dad, Sheriff Stalinsky, and the police are out searching for half of a missing girl's body. Joggers found the first half earlier. Styles convinces Scott to tag along and investigate. Scott isn't thrilled. He's got lacrosse tryouts the next day, but Styles brushes it off, saying he'll just be warming the bench anyway. They sneak into the woods, but the hike up the steep hill is brutal for Scott. Thanks to his asthma, he stops to use his inhaler, but Styles is way too excited. He sprints ahead and ditches him while trying to catch up. Scott accidentally runs straight into a cop and his search dog and ends up busted. Sheriff Stalinsky finds Styles too, scolds him for listening to police calls and asks where Scott is. Styles plays it cool, lying that Scott stayed home. The sheriff doesn't buy it, but drags Styles back to the car anyway. Scott, hiding behind a tree, waits until they leave before making a run for it, but something isn't right. A shadow moves in the trees. He reaches for his inhaler, then suddenly a stampede of deer charges through, knocking him to the ground. His inhaler flies off when the chaos dies down. Scott grabs his phone's flashlight and starts looking for it. Instead, he finds something way worse: the missing girl's other half. Panic hits him hard, but before he can move, a deep growl echoes from behind. A massive wolf-like creature with glowing red eyes emerges from the trees. Scott barely has time to react before it lunges, biting deep into his side. He screams in pain, rolls down a hill and stumbles onto the road, drenched, bleeding and shaken. In the distance a wolf howls, and just like that, Scott McCall's life changes forever. The next morning, Scott rides his bike to school but gets bumped by Jackson Whitmore, a rich and arrogant lacrosse player. He meets up with Styles and shows him a big bite wound on his side. Scott thinks it was a wolf, but Styles says there haven't been wolves in California for over 60 years. Scott also says he found the other half of the dead body in the woods, which excites Styles, but Styles quickly gets distracted when he sees Lydia Martin, his longtime crush. She ignores him and he jokingly blames Scott for making him look uncool in English class. The teacher writes metamorphosis on the board, which oddly fits Scott's situation. A loud ringtone suddenly startles him and he realizes he can hear a phone ringing outside. He sees a new girl, Alicia in Argent, sitting on a bench and is shocked that he can hear her whole conversation from far away. A few minutes later, she walks into class and takes the only open seat behind Scott. When she doesn't have a pen, he hands her one. They smile at each other. After school, Scott and Styles go to their lockers. Scott sees Allison again and they smile at each other before Lydia walks up and compliments Allison's jacket. Allison says her mom was a fashion buyer, which impresses Lydia right away. Lydia calls Allison her new best friend. Jackson joins them, casually showing off that he's Lydia's boyfriend. He and Lydia invite Allison to a party after the lacrosse scrimmage, but she says she has family night. Jackson keeps bragging about the team's championships and Allison finally agrees to watch practice. At practice, Styles worries about being stuck on the bench, but Scott is focused. He wants to finally make first line. Allison and Lydia sit in the bleachers watching. Coach Finstock puts Scott in goal, expecting him to fail. The loud whistle hurts Scott's ears so much that he doubles over in pain. A player takes a shot and hits Scott's helmet hard. Scott recovers and suddenly realizes his vision and reflexes are sharper. The next shot comes at him and time slows down. He easily catches the ball, then he blocks 3 more shots in a row, shocking everyone. Styles, coach, and even Lydia are surprised. Allison watches impressed. Scott knows something about about him has changed. Scott's new skills grab everyone's attention, especially Jackson, who tries to embarrass him with a powerful shot, but Scott catches it like it's nothing. Jackson is frustrated, especially when he sees Lydia cheering for Scott. The whole crowd, including Styles and Allison, goes wild over Scott's amazing performance. Scott's freaking out, heightened senses, freaky reflexes, and a nose sharper than a damn bloodhound. To prove it, he calls out the gum flavor in Styles' pocket before Styles even realizes he has any. Scott's convinced it's some medical nightmare, but Styles just cracks werewolf jokes. Scott's not laughing. They head to the woods to find Scott's inhaler, but some mysterious dude shows up, glares at them, and tosses it back. Styles recognizes Derek Hale, the guy whose whole family died in a fire years ago, and at the animal clinic Scott checks the wound from his bite, except there isn't one. It healed overnight. The clinic's cats freak out, hissing like he's the devil before he can process. Allison shows up drenched and crying about hitting a dog. Scott calms her down, calms the dog with glowing eyes, no big deal, and even patches up its broken leg like a pro. Their chemistry is clearly off the charts. Scott offers her a dry shirt, sneaks a glance while she changes, and the dog judges him hard. Awkward before leaving, she ditches her family night excuse and agrees to Lydia's party. Scott crashes for the night, then wakes up in the woods barefoot in a coyote den. Next morning he's back in the forest wearing nothing but boxers. He spots a shadowy beast, the same one that bit him. Panic mode activated. He bolts, jumps a fence, and lands straight in someone's backyard pool at school. Jackson corners him in the locker room, grilling him about his sudden athletic glow-up steroids. Scott denies it, but Jackson's not buying it and promises to get answers. Lacrosse tryouts roll around, and Scott's a damn machine, speed, agility, and an insane front flip goal. Coach is hyped, but Styles stays still. Something seriously off, and they both know it. That night Styles goes full conspiracy mode, digging into werewolf lore. Full moon's rage triggers and the nightmare Scott's walking into. When Scott shows up, Styles straight up tells him, "Dude, you're turning into a werewolf. Cancel your date with Allison before you maul someone." Scott refuses, so Styles grabs his phone to do it himself. Bad move. Scott nearly decks him but stops last second, instead wrecking a chair and storming out. Once he's gone, Styles stares at the deep claw marks in the wood. Scott picks up Allison, brushing off his mom's questions. The party at the Maron house starts off great until he spots Sturk lurking. A dog growls at Derek, but one look shuts it up. Scott blinks and Derek's gone, replaced by a shadowy figure leaping onto the roof. Scott tries to shake it off, dancing with Allison, but when his eyes meet Lydia's across the pool, wrapped up with Jackson, unease creeps, and then the full moon rises. A tidal wave of nausea, sharp noises, and overwhelming scents slam into him. Panicked, he bolts, leaving Allison confused before she can follow. Dirk steps out of the shadows, introducing himself as Scott's friend at home. Scott douses himself in ice-cold water, desperate to stop the burn crawling under his skin. His hands shake, nails sharpening into claws. His teeth lengthen, his eyes glow amber, staring at his own monstrous reflection. Terror grips him. Meanwhile, Styles pounds on Scott's door, but Scott refuses to let him in. Then he learns Derek took Allison home. That's it. His last shred of control snaps. Fully transformed, he crashes through his window and tears into the woods, tracking Allison's scent. He's stopped by Derek, but before Scott can react, a flashbang arrow detonates, blinding them. A second arrow pinned Scott to a tree. Hunters and leading them is Chris Argent. Derek fights them off, yanking Scott free. Once safe, he drops the bomb. Hunters have been after their kind for generations. The next day, Scott tries to patch things up with Allison. She forgives him until her dad pulls up. That's when Scott sees his face, Chris Argent, the hunter who nearly killed him shortly after Wolf Moon. Scott panics in the locker room as Styles asks if he apologized to Allison. Scott admits she gave him a second chance, but freaks out, revealing her dad is the lead werewolf hunter who shot him. Styles calms him down, suggesting he focus on lacrosse at practice. Scott is so distracted that he plays terribly. The stress plus taunts from Jackson and Coach Finstock push him over the edge. He rages out, tackles Jackson and starts transforming, unaware that Derek is watching from the shadows. Realizing Scott is losing control, Styles drags him back to the locker room. When Scott fully shifts and attacks him, Styles blasts him with a fire extinguisher, snapping him back. Horrified, Scott realizes he nearly hurt his best friend. Styles warns that any spike in his pulse could trigger another shift, meaning he has to sit out Saturday's game. That night, Melissa tells Scott she took Saturday off to see his game. Unable to explain why he won't play, he tries to convince her not to come, but she insists. Later, Styles video calls Scott, revealing Jackson's injury means the team is lying on him. Scott's computer glitches, then Styles texts, "It looks like someone's behind you." Scott turns to see Derek lurking. Derek pins him to the wall, warning that if Scott plays he'll kill him himself, because if the town learns what Scott is they'll hunt them both. Scott tells Coach he cannot play in the upcoming game, citing personal issues. Coach assumes it is relationship drama or drugs, but Scott insists he is struggling with aggression. Coach refuses to accept his reasoning and warns that if he cannot handle the pressure he will be benched. In the hallway, Allison tells Scott she is coming to his game and invites him to hang out afterward with Jackson, Lydia, and Styles. Later in math class, Lydia confronts Scott about the rumor that he is not playing. When he confirms it, she warns that if both he and Jackson sit out the team will lose, and she refuses to date losers. Scott insists he is protecting lives, but Lydia threatens to introduce Allison to rival players if he refuses to play. Styles has Scott use his werewolf hearing to eavesdrop on his father, who announces a 9:30 p.m. curfew due to the body found in the woods. Styles scoffs at the idea that his father is hunting the rabbit animal while Derek remains free. Scott reminds him they cannot tell the sheriff about Derek, but Styles insists they should find the rest of the body down the hall. Lydia introduces Allison to other lacrosse players while giving Scott a pointed look. When Scott sees Allison wearing the jacket Derek stole, he aggressively questions her about Derek, making her uncomfortable. She becomes unsettled and leaves. Scott later tracks Derek to the Hale house, demanding that he stay away from Allison. Derek warns that if Scott loses control on the field and shifts in front of his mother and friends, his life will be ruined. That night, Scott tells Styles he smelled blood at Derek's home and wants to find proof to get him arrested. However, he first needs Styles to teach him how to play lacrosse without shifting, as he cannot miss the game. At the morgue, Scott takes in the scent of the half-body found in the woods while Styles keeps watch. Jackson, after a cortisone shot, tells Lydia the doctor warned against making it a habit. Lydia insists he get another before the game. Scott tells Styles the scent matches the one at the Hale house. Styles suggests Derek buried the other half of the body there and questions Scott's real motive. When Scott reveals the body's legs had bite marks, Styles concludes they need a shovel. Scott and Styles wait for Derek to leave before sneaking into the yard. A fresh patch of dirt catches their attention and they start digging despite Scott's unease. The moment they pull up a burlap-wrapped object, Styles unties the knots, revealing the front half of a dark brown wolf. Just as they consider leaving, Styles spots a purple flower nearby and identifies it as a wolfbane. Scott's ignorance annoys him, but the irritation vanishes when he notices the plant is woven into a spiral of rope wrapped around the wolf's body. The second Styles unwinds it, the body shifts, revealing the top half of a human woman, sending both into a horrified panic. The next morning, Derek is hauled off in cuffs as Scott and Styles watch from a distance. Derek's glare burns into them as he is placed in the back seat of the cruiser while the deputies search the crime scene. Styles sneaks into the car, trying to act unbothered before immediately taking back his bravado. He presses Derek for answers, pointing out that the dead girl was a werewolf but different from Scott. Derek doesn't explain but warns that Scott shifting on the field will be a disaster, urging Stiles to stop him before Stiles can respond. His father yanks him out of the car, grilling him about how he found the body. Stiles' weak excuse contradicts his earlier lies, but Sheriff Stalinsky lets him go with a warning. As they drive home, Scott flips through Stiles' werewolf books, finding nothing on wolfbane rituals. His irritation flares when Stiles gets too excited, but the real problem hits when he starts gasping for air. Stiles' backpack stuffed with wolfsbane is making him sick. He tosses it out the window before disappearing. Stiles panics and calls emergency dispatch, but they hang up. Meanwhile, Scott, fully transformed, sneaks onto Allison's roof. As he leaps down, Argent's car hits him, forcing him back to human. Allison rushes out horrified, but Scott awkwardly claims he was just stopping by before scrambling off. At the game, Jackson sabotages Scott, but when Coach demands someone pass to him, Scott's anger surges. His car forces an opponent to throw him the ball. He teeters on losing control until Allison's voice breaks through the noise, calming him enough to score the winning goal. Overwhelmed, he flees to the locker room. Stiles finds him later, but the good mood shatters when Stiles reveals the dead girl was Derek's sister, Laura Hale. Scott and Allison sneak out of school and into a bus where they share a romantic moment. As their passion intensifies, Scott's werewolf instincts kick in and he struggles to control his transformation. He pulls away, warning Allison to leave, but she panics when she sees his monstrous form. She tries to escape, but the bus doors are jammed and Scott attacks her. The next day, Scott wakes up and realizes it was just a dream, one so vivid that he fears it might be a warning. He confides in Stiles, who jokes that there's no lycanthropy for beginner class but agrees it's concerning. When they arrive at school, they find a crime scene in the bus bay where deputies investigate a blood-covered bus with its back door torn off. This eerily matches Scott's nightmare, making him fear that he actually attacked someone in his sleep. Panicking, Scott desperately searches for Allison, but she hasn't responded to his texts. His frustration causes him to dent a locker with his fist. Just as he's about to leave, he bumps into Allison, who is completely fine. Relieved, he walks with her to class, unaware that Jackson later finds his ruined locker door. During chemistry, Scott and Stiles discuss the attack, with Stiles suggesting Scott might have killed an animal, not a person. Their conversation is cut short when they see paramedics wheeling out a severely mauled but alive man at lunch. Stiles reassures Scott that the victim survived, and Scott believes Derek might be able to help him control his transformations. Their friends join the conversation, speculating about the attack. Danny suggests a cougar was responsible, while Jackson coldly assumes the victim was a drug addict. Stiles corrects him, revealing the man was Garrison Myers, a bus driver Scott remembers from childhood. Lydia abruptly changes the subject, announcing that she and Jackson are crashing Scott and Allison's date. Though Allison seems annoyed, Scott agrees, wanting to spend time with her. When Jackson mocks his bowling skills, Scott lies, claiming he's great at it. Stiles later calls Scott out for his terrible bowling skills and continues worrying about Scott losing control. Their conversation shifts when Stiles frets about Danny not finding him attractive, but Scott is too focused on whether he actually hurt someone to pay attention at work. Scott is on edge when Sheriff Stalinsky arrives at the clinic, fearing he's a suspect. However, the sheriff is only there to get his canine unit stitches removed, easing Scott's nerves for now. Sheriff Stalinsky shows Dr. Dion photos of the recent attack back, revealing they found wolf hairs on Laura Hale's body. Scott nervously points out that wolves haven't been in California for decades, but Dion explains they can migrate from other states. He also describes how wolves attack prey Deepening Scott's fear, Scott later visits the hospital to bring dinner to his mother, but she immediately realizes he's trying to butter her up for car privileges. While leaving, Scott catches Myers' scent and follows it to his hospital room. Myers, barely conscious, grabs Scott's sleeve and mumbles incoherently, further convincing Scott that he's responsible. Meanwhile, a deputy checks out the Hale house ruins but is terrified by Derek Hale, who silently watches from the shadows. Derek scares the Dewey's canine companion, forcing the officer to leave. Soon after, Scott arrives pleading for Derek's help. Derek bluntly tells him that he will hurt and possibly kill someone, but offers to teach him control for a price. To uncover the truth, Derek instructs Scott to use his senses at the bus crime scene. That night, Scott sneaks onto the bus with Stiles as lookout. Using his heightened senses, Scott has fragmented flashbacks of the attack. He remembers the Alpha calling him waking up and running into the night, and most crucially, he wasn't attacking Myers, he was trying to protect him and was injured in the process. Before Scott can process it, police cruisers approach, forcing him to flee with Stiles. Scott realizes the Alpha was behind the attack, but he still mistakenly believes it's Derek. Stiles jokes that this proves Scott isn't a killer and is relieved for his own safety. Scott, now confident, looks forward to his date with Allison. Meanwhile, Lydia helps Allison pick an outfit, criticizing her fashion sense. Chris Sargent walks in unannounced, annoying Allison. Lydia, however, flirts with him. Much to Allison's frustration, Chris enforces a strict curfew due to an alleged wild animal attacking people, but Allison, frustrated with her father's control, sneaks out through her window. Despite Lydia's disbelief at the bowling alley, Scott, Allison, Lydia, and Jackson play with Jackson excelling while Scott struggles at first. Allison encourages Scott, even telling him to imagine her naked, which oddly helps him bowl a strike. Lydia pretends to be bad but eventually reveals her skill, annoying Jackson. Meanwhile, Derek gets harassed by Chris Sargent and his fellow hunters at a gas station. Chris makes veiled threats about Derek's family before a hunter smashes his car window. Derek realizes they are fully aware of his werewolf identity and history. Back at the bowling alley, Scott starts winning, which enrages Jackson, who storms off to play pinball. Scott tries to smooth things over, but Jackson remains suspicious, convinced Scott cheated and vowing to uncover his secret. At the hospital, Derek visits Garrison Mears, who panics upon recognizing him and repeatedly apologizes before dying of cardiac arrest. Melissa McCall, exhausted from her shift, tries to save him but fails. After walking Allison home, Scott nervously asks to see her again. She agrees, preferring a one-on-one date next time. They share a kiss before parting ways, unaware that Chris Sargent is watching from inside at Scott's house. Stiles sneaks in through the window, nearly getting hit by Melissa, who is fed up with their antics. She reminds them of the curfew before heading to bed. Stiles then informs Scott that Garrison has died. Furious, Scott confronts Derek at the Hale house, accusing him of murder. Derek denies it, revealing that his sister Laura was killed and used his bait to lure him back to Beacon Hills. Scott, still convinced Derek is guilty, threatens to expose him to the sheriff. Scott transforms into a werewolf after Derek shoves him down the stairs. Enraged, he throws Derek through a wall, but Derek quickly recovers and transforms into his own werewolf form. The two fight, with Derek overpowering Scott, eventually forcing him back into human form. Derek then reveals that neither of them killed Garrison and that Scott was bitten by an alpha, not him. Shocked, Scott learns that an alpha werewolf is in town and Derek needs his help to stop it. Since the alpha bit Scott, he is part of its pack, making him the one the alpha seeks. Kate Argent arrives in Beacon Hills, laughing at a radio report about animal attacks. As she drives, the alpha werewolf chases her, eventually jumping onto her SUV. It smashes through the window and tries to pull her out, but she grabs a shotgun and fires through the roof, hitting the alpha. It retreats and Kate escapes, landing in a defensive stance. She shouts a challenge before the scene shifts. Scott, in bed, wakes up upon hearing gunshots and the alpha's howl. He quickly gets dressed and and sneaks out of the house. Meanwhile, Kate stops in the warehouse district, swapping her shotgun for a sniper rifle loaded with special bullets. At the Argent house, Chris Argent prepares to leave, telling his daughter Allison that Kate needs a ride due to a flat tire, though he's clearly lying. Derek Hale tracks the Alpha blood trail and sees it watching him from a warehouse roof. The Alpha growls and takes off, prompting Derek to follow. Kate, armed with her rifle, moves in wild direct leaps from rooftop to rooftop. She takes a shot, hitting Derek's forearm midair. He crashes onto an awning before hitting the ground hard. Chris arrives and orders Kate into the car. Meanwhile, Scott, hiding nearby, listens, and as Kate explains that 2 werewolves attacked her and that the one she shot has 48 hours to live. Derek, now wounded behind the warehouse, sees his injury glowing bluish-purple and smoking. His body isn't healing. The next morning, Kate and Allison excitedly reunite when Allison picks up one of Kate's bags. Kate aggressively stops her, apologizing awkwardly. Allison, suspicious, notices Kate lying about her car's condition but doesn't call her out. At school, Scott updates Stiles on the situation. Stiles asks key questions: who is the Alpha? Did it kill the bus driver? Does Allison's dad know? Scott has no answers. His attention shifts when he gets a D- on a test, and Stiles jokes about his priorities, urging him to take advantage of his study session with Allison. Derek, visibly unwell, stumbles through the hallway and corners Jackson, demanding to know Scott's whereabouts. Jackson mistakes Derek for a steroid dealer, mocking his sickly appearance. Losing patience, Derek grabs Jackson's neck, accidentally stabbing him with his claws before realizing his loss of control and rushing away. Derek, overhearing Allison seeking Lydia's advice about sex, realizes where to find Scott after school. He intercepts Stiles in the parking lot and gets Scott's attention. Derek reveals he was shot with a special bullet and can't heal, making Scott realize Kate was talking about him when she mentioned a werewolf dying in 48 hours. To avoid suspicion, they get Derek into Stiles' Jeep, and Derek insists Scott must find out what kind of bullet Kate used while studying at Allison's house. Though hesitant, Scott agrees, leaving Stiles to deal with an increasingly weak Derek. Scott confirms his study plans with Allison, who questions his interaction with Derek. He dismisses it as giving Derek a ride before heading to her house. When he arrives, his rushed and suspicious behavior raises Allison's doubts, but he claims he's stressed about school. Once inside, studying quickly turns into making out on her bed. Mid-kiss, Scott loses control, his claws extending, but he regains composure before Allison notices. Stiles calls him, and though he initially ignores it, he steps away to return the call. Meanwhile, Stiles drives with a deteriorating Derek, who refuses to go home, fearing the hunters. When Stiles asks if he's dying, Derek hints at a last resort while observing his worsening wound, now leak blackened blood. Stiles, disgusted, nearly kicks him out, but Derek's threat forces him to continue driving back. At Allison's, Scott finds a photo of her with Kate, learning she's Allison's beloved aunt. When he asks about her skills, Allison reveals her past as a nationally ranked archer. She takes Scott to the garage, shows off her bow, and downplays the presence of numerous locked-up firearms, explaining her father is a legal arms dealer. Scott, knowing Argent is a hunter, nervously asks if she plans to join the family business, but Allison playfully flirts. Instead, they resume making out, only to be interrupted by Argent and Kate's return. Though they try to hide, Argent catches them and assigns them grocery duty. Argent subtly pressures Scott to leave, but Kate invites him to stay for dinner. At the table, Argent tests Scott with alcohol, which he declines, while Kate casually chats about lacrosse. Scott excuses himself to take Stiles' call, who is struggling with Derek's worsening condition. Scott instructs him to take Derek to the animal clinic. Derek, seizing the phone, reminds Scott he's Running out of time to find the bullet when Scott hesitates, Strick warns him the Alpha will call him again and next time he'll have to kill or be killed. Scott sneaks into Kate's room during a tense family dinner and finds sniper rifle rounds used against Derek, confirming his suspicions. He snaps a photo of the wooden box they were in and sends it to Stiles, who identifies the rounds as containing Nordic blue monk's hood, a rare strain of wolfbane. Derek, suffering from a severe wolfbane infection, instructs Stiles to get a bullet from Scott or he will die. Scott reluctantly retrieves one and prepares to leave, but Kate insists he stay for dessert. Chris Argent uses the opportunity to test Scott, subtly hinting at werewolves in a speech about rabid dogs at the animal clinic. Dirk's condition worsens, his infected veins spread up his arm, prompting him to demand Stiles amputated before the infection reaches his heart. Stiles panics at the idea, nearly fainting, but Derek threatens him into compliance. Meanwhile, Scott prepares to leave the Argent house, but Kate accuses him of taking something from her bag before she can search him. Allison intervenes, pulling out a condom she had taken from Kate's bag earlier, successfully deflecting suspicion. Scott rushes to the clinic with the bullet just in time to stop Stiles from sawing off Derek's arm. However, when Derek tries to use the bullet, he collapses and the bullet rolls into a vent. Scott struggles to retrieve it, but eventually extends his claws to reach it. Stiles wakes Derek with a punch and Derek burns the wolf's bane inside the bullet before rubbing the ashes into his wound, finally healing himself with Dirk's life saved. Scott demands that he leave them alone, even threatening to expose everything to the Argents. In response, Derek takes Scott to visit his uncle Peter Hale, the only survivor of the Hale family massacre. He reveals that the Argents set the fire that killed his family, breaking their supposed code by killing humans as well. Scott struggles to believe this but begins to question Allison's role in the family's dark history. Later, Kate and Chris discuss the recent werewolf sightings. While Chris insists they follow the code, Kate hints at her involvement in the Hale fire. Her smirk as she lights a match in the fireplace suggests she may have been the one responsible for the massacre, though Chris remains unaware. Jackson and Lydia sit in Lydia's car debating which movie to rent. Jackson begs to watch Horrors, but Lydia refuses, making Jackson reluctantly fetch the notebook instead. Inside the store, Jackson finds an employee dead with his throat tripped out. Shocked, he accidentally knocks over a ladder, causing a fluorescent light to crash, cutting the store's power outside. Lydia, unaware of the chaos, takes selfies inside. Jackson spots the alpha werewolf lurking in the shadows. The alpha knocks over shelves like Damo, forcing Jackson to dodge just as the alpha closes and it notices glowing claw marks on Jackson's neck and abruptly flees. Jackson, terrified, smashes through the store's glass door, startling Lydia, who unknowingly captures the fleeing werewolf on her phone. Meanwhile, Sheriff Stalinsky and Stiles are having dinner when they receive a homicide call. They arrive at the crime scene where paramedics check on Jackson and Lydia. The sheriff insists Jackson get medical attention, but Jackson snaps, calling him a minimum wage rent-op. Stiles is both horrified and amazed when he sees Elle's body being wheeled out on the store's rooftop. Scott and Derek watch the aftermath. Scott struggles to understand the Alpha's motives, questioning if all werewolves are killers. Derek clarifies that werewolves are predators, not murderers, and vows to uncover the Alpha's reasons for killing. As they leave, a red spiral appears on the rooftop, marking the Alpha's presence. Later, Scott and Derek return to the Hale house, where Scott complains about balancing school and werewolf problems. Derek warns that the Alpha is targeting Scott for his pack and that time is running out before the next full moon to train Scott. Derek breaks his arm attempting to teach him how to control his wolf form under pain, but Scott fails at home. Kate gives Allison an early birthday present, a silver pendant featuring a wolf and a fleur-de-lis. She tells Allison to research the symbol, hinting at the family's mysterious history. At school, Allison opens her locker to find helium balloons spilling out. Clearly embarrassed, Scott sees and learns it's her birthday, deciding they should ditch school to Celebrate in chemistry class. The teacher announces mandatory parent-teacher conferences for students with low grades, including Scott. Stiles questions Danny about Lydia and Jackson's whereabouts the previous night, but Danny knows little. Stiles, flustered, randomly asks Danny if he finds him attractive, then panics so much he falls out of his chair. Scott and Allison sneak off in her car, hesitant about skipping school but ultimately deciding to go through with it. Meanwhile, in the locker room, Derek confronts Jackson, demanding to know what he saw at the video store. Jackson denies seeing anything, but Derek pins him against the lockers, listening to his heartbeat to test if he's lying. Before leaving, Derek warns Jackson to get his mysterious claw marks checked. Scott and Allison spend the day at the Beacon Hills Preserve, flirting and growing closer at the Martin house. Natalie Martin tells Lydia that Stiles is there to see her. Lydia, still under the effects of anti-anxiety medication, mumbles about Stiles. When Stiles arrives, he asks Lydia what she saw during the attack on the video rental store. She responds that she saw a mountain lion, which Stiles realizes is just her repeating what the police told her. Meanwhile, Scott and Allison walked through the woods, with Allison briefly texting Lydia before turning off her phone. Still dazed, Lydia asks Stiles to stay, and he is momentarily excited when she leans toward him as if to kiss him until she calls him Jackson. Frustrated, Stiles watches as she passes out. He notices her phone buzzing and sees that she received a video of the Alpha running out of the video store, captured while she was taking selfies in the woods near the Hale House ruins. Kate Argent and her fellow hunters approach despite being told to wait for Chris. Kate is impatient. One hunter jokes about Derek and Kate cry, suggests more provocative insults inside the house. Derek is training when gunfire suddenly blasts through the walls. He fights off two hunters but is struck with a high-voltage taser by Kate, who mocks him and considers whether to kill him or seduce him at the Stalinsky house. Stiles panics over the video he found on Lydia's phone and tries to contact Scott, who has turned off his phone. Sheriff Stalinsky enters, hoping for good news regarding Stiles' academics, but Stiles' vague response suggests otherwise. Sheriff, seemingly expecting disappointment, leaves while Stiles desperately waits for Scott to call back. Back at the Hale house, Kate shocks Derek again with a taser before revealing a shocking truth: she and the hunters did not kill Laura Hale. She explains that the bite marks on Laura's body indicate the Alpha was responsible. Kate offers to help kill the Alpha if Derek identifies him, but when she realizes he has no idea who it is, she dismisses him as useless and attempts to shoot him. Derek escapes into the woods at super speed. At the Beacon Hills Animal Clinic, Alan Dion leaves a voicemail for Scott, concerned about his absence. Sheriff Stalinsky arrives, seeking Dion's help regarding the video store attack. Dion, nervous, claims to be no expert, but Sheriff points out that Dion was previously certain the attacker was a mountain lion. Sheriff then reveals stills from surveillance footage showing the Alpha transitioning from running on all fours to walking upright. Uncomfortable, Dion avoids further discussion and excuses himself to tend to a sick dog in the preserve. Allison tells Scott that her birthday has been kind of perfect. Scott jokes that he can tell when she lies because she touches her eyebrow. Allison wishes her parents weren't coming home so she and Scott could spend more time together. Suddenly, Scott remembers that he was supposed to attend the parent-teacher conference. Realizing he's in trouble due to his poor grades at the high school, the parents meet with teachers. Mr. Harris discusses Jackson with Mr. Whitmore, noting Jackson's intense drive and assumption that it stems from his adoption. Meanwhile, Lydia's parents bicker, assuming she has academic issues, but M. Ramsey reveals that Lydia is exceptionally gifted with a GPA over 5.0 and strong leadership potential. Sheriff Stalinsky meets with Coach Finstock, who is baffled by Stiles' real name and calls him intelligent but unfocused. He humorously recalls Stiles' midterm answer about male circumcision, much to the sheriff's embarrassment. Melissa McCall, frustrated by Scott's behavior, orders him to get to the school immediately. Chris and Victoria Argent Meet with M. Ramsey, who praises Allison for adjusting well despite frequent relocations. Victoria insists they have an open relationship with Allison. When the teacher mentions Allison missed school, Chris is shocked and becomes concerned. Allison and Scott drive back to school while Melissa, furious over Scott's absence, leaves him a voicemail. Chris and Victoria also search for Allison, concerned about her behavior. Melissa overhears their conversation and approaches them, revealing she is Scott's mother. Chris responds coldly, accusing Scott of kidnapping Allison. However, their argument halts when they see Scott and Allison arriving. Melissa immediately confronts Scott, demanding to know where he has been. Scott nervously says nowhere, confirming Melissa's suspicion that he skipped school. Allison tries to defend him, but Chris orders her into the car. Suddenly screams erupt as people flee the school parking lot in panic. Scott senses something and moves to investigate while Allison looks around, noticing the chaos. Chris retrieves a gun, sensing danger while people scatter. Terrified, Scott follows his instincts toward the source of the disturbance. While Allison, Chris and others brace for whatever is coming, Scott runs through a parking garage, is chased by a werewolf, but it's just Derek testing him. Scott asks Derek to teach him how to control his werewolf side. Derek agrees but tells Scott to stay away from Allison because she's a distraction. Scott promises but goes to see her anyway. Later, Scott comes face to face with the alpha werewolf, who scratches a spiral on his window just like the one on Derek's sister's grave. Scott tells Derek, and Derek is clearly shaken since Scott's anger triggers his transformation. Stiles decides to help him stay calm. They figure out that Allison is the only one who keeps Scott in control. Meanwhile, Jackson is freaked out by the claw marks on his neck and starts having weird hallucinations. Derek goes to see his uncle, who was burned in the fire, to ask about the alpha but gets no answers. He later finds a news article about a dead deer with a spiral carved into its fur. The town vet handled the case, so Derek goes to see him. When the vet refuses to talk, Derek loses his patience and knocks him out just as Scott arrives and stops him. Scott tells Derek to meet him at school that night. He and Stiles sneak in and use the PA system to call the alpha. Derek shows up with the unconscious vet in his car, but before they can figure anything out, the alpha grabs Derek and slams him into a wall, knocking him out cold. Scott and Stiles panic and run inside, locking themselves in the school. They don't know if Drake is alive and the alpha is still out there hunting them. Scott and Stiles are trapped in the school, trying to figure out how to escape without getting ripped apart by the alpha werewolf, but the alpha isn't letting them go so easily. It blocks every exit and straight up murders the janitor. Meanwhile, Allison gets a weird text from Scott telling her to meet him at the school. She shows up with Jackson and Lydia, only to find themselves trapped in the cafeteria. Scott realizes he never sent the text. Now everyone's demanding answers. Panicking, Scott lies. He says Derek is the one after them. Stiles, not wanting to risk it anymore, calls his dad, the sheriff. The group makes a run for a science classroom where they find a locked door leading to a fire escape. They need the janitor's keys. Scott tracks the janitor's scent to the gym and finds his body shoved under the bleachers, but before he can grab the keys, the alpha appears. It lets out a bone-shaking howl, forcing Scott to transform against his will. Jackson, still messed up from his scratches, reacts too. Scott stumbles back to the classroom in full werewolf mode, barely in control, just as he's about to lose it completely. Allison's voice cuts through his rage, snapping him back. He changes back to normal just in time for the cops to bust in. Stiles' dad is here and they're finally safe outside. Scott sees the vet perfectly fine, like nothing ever happened. Then it hits him, the alpha never planned to kill them. It wanted Scott to do it. The whole thing was a setup to push Scott into slaughtering his own friends, forcing him into the alpha's pack. And the worst part, deep down Scott actually wanted to kill them all when he transformed. That's enough for Allison. She's done. If she can't trust Scott, she can't be with him. Just Like that she breaks up with him. Stiles takes Scott into the woods to get drunk, hoping to cheer him up after his breakup with Allison, but things get messy when two guys show up and take their bottle. Scott, already on edge because of the full moon coming, gets pissed. Not long after, the alpha werewolf shows up and kills the two men at school. Scott starts acting weird, hallucinating, losing control, and just not being himself. He and Stiles decide to lock Scott up during the full moon so he doesn't end up hurting someone before lacrosse practice. Stiles asks Scott to find out if Lydia likes him, but when Scott talks to Lydia, he only asks about Allison. Lydia dodges the question and instead starts making out with him. Scott later lies to Stiles about it and plays aggressively during practice. Meanwhile, Allison and Jackson talk and agree that Derek wasn't the one who attacked them that night. Stiles cuffed Scott to a radiator, partly to keep him from hurting anyone and partly as payback for kissing Lydia. But as the full moon rises, Scott completely loses it. He transforms, breaks free, and goes after Jackson and Allison just before Scott can attack. Derek, who is very much alive, takes him down and stops him at the same time. The urgent suspect: there's another beta werewolf in town besides Derek. Later, when Scott returns to normal, he's freaked out and asks Derek if there's a cure. Derek tells him there might be one. He'd have to kill the werewolf who bit him. Meanwhile, Jackson finds a claw on his car left by Scott and realizes it matches a hole in Scott's lacrosse glove from before. Something's definitely up. Night settled over Beacon Hills High School. Mr. Harris sat alone staring at a list of people with his last name. Every name had a red cross next to it, except as the sight made him uneasy, a presence loomed behind him. A wet claw was visible, followed by a voice. Mr. Harris stayed frozen, partly from fear, partly from denial. He refused to turn around, but the figure taunted him, accusing him of knowing more than he admitted. When he didn't respond, the figure grew aggressive, throwing chairs. Just as things escalated, Derek appeared and told Harris to duck, ironic considering Derek often mocked his students for lacking common sense. Sirens cut through the night. Derek, still a wanted fugitive, knew the police weren't on his side. He ran. His escape was fast, outrunning cars with inhuman speed. The police chased him, but they weren't alone. Chris Argent was after him. Kate Argent also joined the pursuit, but the car she followed wasn't Derek's, it was Scott and Stiles running a diversion. Scott, not known for reckless driving, struggled with the high-speed chase. Chris fired shots, but Scott reached Derek first. Derek jumped into the car and they sped off. Frustration burned in Derek. He had been close to catching the Alpha before the police showed up, and now, thanks to Scott, he was the most wanted man in the state. His last conversation with his sister had revealed two things: a man named Harris and a symbol. The next day, Scott worried about how to get Allison's necklace. Stiles, ever optimistic, suggested a bold plan: win Allison over with honesty. Scott lacked the courage for that. The plan was clear: get the necklace, find the Alpha, get cured, and win Allison back. But with Scott's slow reactions, this would likely drag out for the rest of the season. Meanwhile, Jackson lay on an examination table as a doctor inspected the wounds on his neck. Nightmares had haunted him, but the real horror came when the doctor used a tool to extract a vein of bloody wolf span from his wound. Then he woke up. Just a dream. In reality, the doctor dismissed his injuries as minor and prescribed antibiotics for aconite poisoning. Jack, confused, realized he somehow knew what aconite was without ever learning it. Determined to figure it out, Jackson charmed Melissa McCall into letting him use a hospital computer. He searched for wolfsbane. His suspicions grew as school. Jackson confronted Scott, claiming to know his secret. He wanted to become a werewolf and threatened to expose Scott if he refused to help. This made getting the necklace even more urgent. Scott tried to sit next to Allison, but Lydia back to her usual self blocked him as a weak attempt to reconnect. Scott sent Allison old photos of them together. It only made things worse. A new plan formed, stealing the necklace. Jackson meanwhile tested Scott's patience, mocking his lacrosse skills and his breakup with Allison. Scott, frustrated, snapped his lunch tray in half. Jackson smirked and took a loud bite from his apple. Later, Jackson and Allison swam in the school pool. Jackson, ever confident, joked about his cheekbones giving him an advantage. Meanwhile, Scott searched Allison's bag but found nothing in the hallway. Jackson walked confidently until Lydia stopped him, demanding an explanation for a text he had sent. He had asked for his spare house key back, coldly announcing their relationship was over. Lydia, shocked, questioned him, but Jackson dismissed her as dead weight. At home, Stiles found Derek waiting in his room when his father nearly walked in. Stiles distracted him with small talk about lacrosse. Once alone, he turned to Danny for help, tracing an ominous text sent to Allison. Danny refused at first, but Stiles had an idea: get Derek to pose as his cousin Miguel and flex for Danny's amusement. Derek, unimpressed, played along. It worked. Danny agreed to help but needed more details about the text. Scott later snuck into Allison's bedroom and found the necklace being used as a bookmark in an old Werewolf Hunter history book. Allison had circled things inside, making Scott wonder if she even knew its real importance. Meanwhile, Danny traced the ominous text to a computer at Beacon Hills Hospital, one registered to Melissa McCall. Scott left the Argent home. Chris stopped him, inviting him in for a drink. It wasn't hospitality, it was an interrogation about Derek. Allison returned just in time to overhear Scott insist that he only wanted to protect her. He left without noticing her presence elsewhere. Allison went for a run and stumbled upon Derek's abandoned house. She entered only for Kate to appear. Their conversation hinted at something darker. An unspoken past between Kate and Derek, suggesting that the real monster might not be Derek after all. At the hospital, Stiles looked for Melissa but discovered something horrifying. Peter Hale's bed was empty. The supposedly comatose Peter was the alpha. Worse, the nurse who had been caring for him was the one who had sent the ominous text. Her intentions were far from innocent. Before she could act, Derek knocked her unconscious. Peter, unbothered, expressed mild disappointment. Derek wasn't amused, calling her out as Peter's willing accomplice. The fight that followed wasn't even close. Peter, stronger and faster, tossed Derek around with ease, grabbing him by the throat. He spoke of his suffering. The years spent healing cell by cell, becoming an alpha, had accelerated his recovery, something he couldn't control. He wanted understanding, not forgiveness. At the police station, Sheriff Stalinsky listened to Mr. Harris, but his mind was on the clock, eager to make it to Stiles' first lacrosse game. Harris recounted a drunken conversation from years ago with a young woman who had asked too many questions about fire science. A week later, the Hale house burned down. He hadn't spoken up because he didn't want to be involved. He never learned the woman's name, but he remembered one detail: the necklace she wore, a family heirloom Harris provided the final clue. The girl wearing that necklace wasn't just an arsonist, she was a murderer. Stiles digs through his dad's research to figure out what's up with the Alpha Werewolf's victims. Turns out the Alpha has been targeting people connected to the fire that killed Dirk's family. Meanwhile, Jackson starts looking real suspicious, and Allison's dad presses him for answers, thinking he might be a beta werewolf. Scott's pissed about this, but Jackson is still obsessed with becoming a werewolf himself. Scott is even more shocked when Derek and his uncle suddenly want him to join the pack. What's worse, Derek seems to be siding with the Alpha now. Before Scott can even process that, the Alpha stabs him in the neck, sending him into some intense flashbacks showing him what really happened during the fire and the murders. While searching for her missing necklace, Allison stumbles across a sharp arrow tip left behind by Kate. She and Lydia head to the woods to test it out. When she sees someone moving in the dark, she panics and zaps them with the taser, only to realize it's Scott. He was just trying to return her necklace. She apologizes, but it's awkward. Later, Allison visits Scott's house to talk. While she's there, they notice Scott's mom, Melissa, getting ready for a date. When Scott opens the His stomach drops. The date is with the alpha werewolf. The alpha's plan is to turn Melissa into a werewolf to force Scott into the pack. Scott ditches Allison in his room and follows his mom, barely stopping the alpha's plan before it's too late. Back at the Hale property, Scott jumps in to save Jackson from getting killed, but things spiral fast. Kate shows up, shoots Scott, and the town vet secretly hauls him back to his clinic while patching Scott up. The vet casually shocks everyone. He mostly works with cats and dogs and sometimes werewolves too. Meanwhile, Kate drops a bomb of her own. She spills the family secret to Allison, and just to make things worse, she's got Derek chained to a wall, torturing him. The winter formal is coming up and Kate decides it's time to give Allison a crash course on werewolves and hunters, using Derek as a live example. Meanwhile, Scott is still recovering at the vet's clinic when Peter rudely barges in, demanding Scott. The vet stands his ground, refusing to hand Scott over. Peter, unable to cross the mountain ash barrier, throws a tantrum, literally launching furniture at the wall. Back at school, Coach Finstock dropped some bad news. Scott's grades are so bad he can't go to the dance. This is a huge problem since the alpha werewolf is targeting Allison. Desperate, Scott pressures Jackson into taking Allison to the dance for protection. Jackson refuses at first, but Scott hulks out just enough to scare him into saying yes. Meanwhile, Allison ropes Lydia into taking Stiles during a shopping trip for the dance. Peter creeps up on Allison, but Scott quickly pulls her away before anything weird happens that night. Kate taunts Derek, revealing that they were once in a relationship before she betrayed him. She also figures out that Scott is the second beta werewolf at the dance. Jackson gets wasted and barely pays attention to Allison. Stiles, on the other hand, is killing it with Lydia, though she's more focused on keeping an eye on Jackson. Scott sneaks in anyway and confesses his love to Allison, which leads to a sweet kiss. Jackson, now completely hammered, stumbles into the woods and spots what he thinks is a werewolf. He demands to be turned, only to realize too late that the shadows belong to werewolf hunters led by Mr. Argent. Panicked, Jackson spills the truth. Scott is the werewolf. Meanwhile, while Lydia goes looking for Jackson but ends up in the wrong place at the worst time, Peter attacks her viciously. Stiles finds Jackson wandering in a daze, completely out of it. Peter then threatens to kill Lydia unless Stiles tells him where Derek is. Scott and Allison sneak off to the school buses for some privacy. Allison steps inside and motions for Scott to follow, but before he can, bam, Chris Argent's car slams into him, pinning him between two vehicles. As Scott struggles, he transforms right in front of Allison. She stares in shock, realizing the truth. Scott jumps away as Allison freaks out over what she just saw. She stumbles off the school bus, collapsing into her dad's arms. Meanwhile, Scott hides in the woods, crying. On the football field, Peter forces Stiles to leave Lydia behind, but he does let him call Jackson to get her medical help. Peter also warns that if Lydia survives the bite, she'll turn into a werewolf. At the Argent house, Chris rips into Kate for leaving so many clues for Allison to find. He's furious that she dragged Allison into their werewolf hunting business. He orders Kate to take Allison and leave town for her safety. Over at the hospital, Sheriff Stalinsky suspects Jackson of hurting Lydia until he realizes Stiles brought her as his date across town. Peter corners Stiles and forces him to track Scott's phone to find Derek. Stiles even takes a random moment to rant about Max, but in the end he figures out Derek is being held under the Argent house. Peter offers to turn Stiles into a werewolf, but Stiles turns him down. As Peter leaves, he smirks, saying Stiles wants the power, he just won't admit it. Scott finds Derek but refuses to free him unless Derek helps take down Peter. To con in him, Scott shows proof that Peter killed Derek's sister on purpose to become the alpha. Furious, Derek breaks out of his last chain himself and agrees to help. At the hospital, Stiles visits Lydia and learns new info from his dad. Kate was the one who set the Hale house on fire. Meanwhile, Jackson and Stiles get captured by Mr. Argent and his hunters, but Stiles manages to convince Argent that Kate was the real monster, not the werewolves. Across town, Kate and Allison ambush Scott and Derek with explosive crossbow arrows, taking them down. Kate prepares to kill them both, shooting Derek first, but before she can shoot Scott despite Allison begging her not to, Chris shows up and forces Kate to stand down. Then Peter crashes the scene. He wipes out the hunters before dragging Kate inside. Allison follows and watches in horror as Peter slits Kate's throat for murdering his family before Peter can turn on her. Scott and Derek jump in for a 2-on-1 fight outside. Stiles and Jackson speed up in a car just as Scott is losing. Stiles chucks a Molotov cocktail at Peter and Allison lights it up with a crossbow arrow. Even Jackson joins and chucks his beer bottle into the flames. The Alpha collapses, burning up, and transforms back into a crispy Peter. Scott and Allison kiss, promising to stay together, but just as Scott begs to be cured, Derek steps out of the house and kills Peter, becoming the new Alpha werewolf. Later, Jackson finds Derek and begs to be turned. Derek smirks and bares his fangs before lunging at him. At the hospital, Scott and Stiles visit Lydia but notice something weird. She isn't healing fast and she hasn't turned into a werewolf. Back at the Argent house, Chris and his wife realize the town will turn on them now that Kate's crimes are exposed, but with more werewolf hunters on the way, they seem less worried about Scott. Now on the rooftop, Scott holds Allison in his arms as they watch the stars, finally finding a moment of peace.